I'm really excited about today's episode because we have a special guest with us today. President, presidential candidate Mike ter Maat, which is he's going to share his insight about the libertarian philosophies and what he believes is his strengths so that we can represent us as a country. So I look forward to meeting him and I look forward to dialoguing and forward having a good show, an informative show that you guys can take back and spread the. If you guys agree, if you guys disagree, but you guys should get to know him a little better, and this would be a great platform to get to know who he truly is and where he stands on his policy positions. So, without further ado, let's bring him on.
All right. With that being said, here's Mike ter Maat.
Gentlemen, how are you? Thank you for letting me join you today.
Well, thank you for
How are we
being
doing?
here.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah,
You bet.
Should be a good conversation. You're living in Virginia, is that right?
That's right. My wife and I relocated to Virginia about 18 months ago. I had been in Florida for over 20 years. The
wow.
last dozen of which I worked as a police officer in Broward County as a second career, and had a good experience in Florida. But it's time to come back to Virginia.
Yeah, Jesse's in Florida right now. I lived in Florida until less than a year ago.
Where were
said
you in-
Broward County?
Yeah, I was in Broward County. Where were you, Seth?
Oh, we were both living in Tampa Bay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good for you.
I mean, I left.
I was born in Miami-Dade County, and I moved
There
to
you
Tampa.
go.
Yeah, when I was in Hillsborough County when I was nine-ish, 10, and
Yep.
I lived in kind of both counties. So you're
I
definitely
like
all
the
Florida.
I like the Tampa area. I love Dade County. I love Miami. Everything about it. If you like fun people and good food, and good people and fun food, Miami is a good place to be.
I 100% agree with that statement. Oh, so I just want to dive into it. So, do you mind if I call you Mike? Or-
Please.
Okay. All right. So, Mike, tell me about why president?
Well, a couple of different reasons. The truth is that the federal government of the United States has been going in the wrong direction for a generation now in a number of ways. And as a libertarian, I recognize that many of the things that our federal government has done wrong, and many of the problems systemically with the way American politics work, have gone wrong in ways that the libertarian philosophy can help rectify. In other words, our government has been moving, and governments around the world have been moving in an authoritarian direction. Having grown out of democracies, authoritarianism can still grow under certain conditions. And we see that those conditions have taken hold in the United States as well as a lot of other places around the world. And what happens is, and I believe that what has happened in the United States is that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have each left behind, to a great extent, what had been their policy agenda of a generation ago. And each has adopted as its number one policy objective to keep the other party out of power. And we know that that's where authoritarianism comes from. It comes from the idea of some politicians saying, what you really have to fear is not the loss of your civil liberties, but what you really have to fear is that other idiot coming to power. And therefore, I need more power to help protect you from that nincompoop, right? And we see with the advent of social media, and before that, cable news, with the splitting of the American public into various camps from which we get our news, we get our politics, how we align our news with our politics, right? We have seen since then a polarization in our politics. And that has led to the idea of each political party simply hating the other one's guts and not worrying so much about what it is that they represent as a matter of policy. So, for example, when I was your age, you could find Democrats, for example, who were anti-war. Not so much anymore, right? A little bit from RFK Jr., who's trying to shake things up in the party. But for the most part, Democrats are on board with a fairly robust projection of military hegemony around the world from the United States Defense Department.
I'll say there's a difference between the elected Democrats and then like the Democratic voting populace. Definitely, I would say the populace is very more anti-war than.
I would agree with that 100%. And I think that is well said, Seth. And indeed, on the Republican side, until very recently, a majority of Republican politicians, I would say as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, were staunchly fiscally conservative. And that's not really the case anymore. Sometimes a Republican will give some lip service to trying to slow down the rate at which government expenditure increases, but you don't see any real serious movement on the Republican side to cap spending, for example. You don't see any movement toward entitlement reform, for example. You don't see any movement toward bringing under control the Federal Reserve system of discretionary monetary policy. So these are just examples where you might have seen a lot more complaining from the Republican side 25 years ago, and certainly 30, 35, 40 years ago, that you just don't see anymore. And for this reason, I think the American public is not only frustrated with the authoritarianism that they see growing inside of our politics, but they're frustrated about the fact that they don't have policy agenda that represents our interests, our values. Seth, to your point, I think that a lot of Americans, a lot of Democrats, a lot of Republicans too, by the way, I believe, are much more open to a robust anti-war message than ever before. And part of that is philosophy, right? Part of that is ethics and values. And part of that is just as an empirical matter, you can no longer point to a recent example of the United States having intervened militarily with some nation abroad in a fashion that the American public would point to and say, that was a good idea. Notwithstanding the thousands of lives lost, or in the case of Afghanistan or Iraq, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, if you were to include foreign nationals, notwithstanding the billions of dollars lost, or again, the case of Iraq or Afghanistan, trillions of dollars lost. Those were good ideas. We just don't have those examples anymore that the American public would say was worth it. And so as an empirical matter, I think Americans are on the edge, at least, of being able to recognize that while we're tactically good in the Defense Department at doing things militarily, we're good at killing, blowing things up, we're good at taking ground, holding ground, we're good at opening sea lanes and protecting sea lanes, we're good at moving people, moving material around. We're not good in a strategic sense. It's not really true that our military has because of political objectives, we have not been able to achieve things that the American public would view as being in our long-term interests. So, having said that, I think the American public is ready to hear that message in a way that they have not been up until now. And that's a very libertarian message. If you define libertarianism as a philosophy that promotes the existence of a government merely to protect your individual rights, to protect your liberty, and to do nothing else, in other words, a series of democratic institutions that are set up with merely delimited powers that exist only to protect us, then you've got to recognize that a lot of the problems that we have with government are problems of having drifted away from our libertarian founding. Libertarianism is the philosophical descendant of the philosophy of the founding fathers when they put together the Constitution. That was their philosophy when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. That was their philosophy when they founded this nation. But we've drifted
Or at
away
least
from
classical liberalism.
What's that?
More like a classical idea, right? Classical liberalism is kind of like
Exactly.
the precedent ideology of the United States until at least early 20th century, right?
Exactly. Agreed wholeheartedly. And I think that we can all debate the extent to which things were instituted that worked well, didn't work well, were philosophically correct or incorrect during the 20th century. I think it'd be very difficult to argue that the 21st century has represented a golden age for the U.S. federal government. There is so much that we have done wrong that it's sort of the elephant and the blind man who feels one part of it and describes the beast one way, and then some other blind individual feels a different part of the elephant and describes it a different way, but they all agree this is one huge mess. It affects us in different ways, and because we may have different objectives or because we have different experiences, we may have different problems with the federal government. But I don't think too many people would argue that it's going in the right direction.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that point up. So I guess one of the things that I want to really dive into is how are you planning to make some of these changes? I know you spoke about authoritarianism, and I wanted you to dive a little bit deeper in what's your philosophy, because as you stated, we're living in a social state where the state essentially is being authorized. It's kind of dictating what we're doing. And so I've watched some videos and talked this out. And you had an interesting idea, using more of a private sector to dictate our social norms and how our social society should be driven. So I dive a little bit into that.
Sure, I appreciate that. And I actually believe that there's very little that our government needs to do that the private sector couldn't do. In many cases, we've gotten used to the public sector doing things, and it seems natural. It seems second nature for us to defer to our government. But there's actually, in my view, very little that we need to rely on the government that the private sector can't handle for itself. So, for example, maybe this conversation goes better with examples, and then we'll bring it together with an overarching philosophy. But as one of the primary examples, I do believe that one of the biggest problems we have in the United States is our crappy schools. Having raised a couple of kids, gone through public schools and private schools in Virginia and in Florida, I can tell you that the way our primary and secondary school systems work is not up to the standards of either other nations. The public schools are typically not up to the standards of the private schools. And none of it is up to the standards that we would expect from other industries. Other major industries in the United States just work better than our school systems do. Our school systems have not made a lot of progress, I would argue, for 50 years in terms of working better or, either as a matter of cost efficiency or in terms of results. And I believe that there is no coincidence between the fact that this is the most protected, monopolized industry in the United States, and it is one of the most frustratingly underperforming industries in the United States.
And I want to make sure are you talking about primary, or are you talking about secondary, collegiate?
Primary and secondary, not higher, not colleges.
Okay.
It has been tradition that the college system in the United States has been the envy of the world. We are quickly losing that. But I believe that we're still a step ahead of the rest of the world. And I think that that's largely because it's maintained in the private sector, whereas most of the rest of the world's universities are managed in the public sector. But having said all of that, the idea that you would take money for primary and secondary education and use it to acquire educational services and then grant a monopoly over a local area, first of all, that's weird. I mean, you would never do that in any other business, right?
I wouldn't say there's any sort of monopoly because there's no ban on private schools. Private schools absolutely exist in every single
No, that's
state
not
and
really
region.
true. That's first of all, empirically, that's not true. There's any number of places that don't have private schools.
Especially Christian schools, especially religious schools.
Well, in Broward County, Florida, you've got half the county doesn't have a private school.
I mean, I can't speak to your specific county, but
I think Seth
I would say
I think Seth's saying that.
Right, but you can't call it not a monopoly. You're only giving one school the money.
Well, no, I'm saying there's no one stopping someone from not creating a school. If have to,
the money is,
for example,
Jesse, the public schools are the only ones that get the money.
Well,
so you think that federal money should be spent towards private schools because their money is there. If it's a private industry, it should be able to withstand on its own market. Nobody's restricting people from going to private schools. If there's a private school that exists in the area and is profitable enough, you can take your kids there and you can spend your money and put your kids in a private school. Shouldn't the market forces be filling in the space there? Like there's no restriction against going to a private school.
Yeah, because I think private schools
should be able to compete with public schools, right?
Okay, we need to come back to that because a lot of what you just said is just not factually correct. But go ahead, we'll come back to
my idea is that the most private schools are about choice, not about education. They want to choose how they educate their child, and so when you have the option of choice, that should be fundly, supported by the government because a choice is a choice. Government provides a basic standard so that we all can, have a functional society. But if you decide to do something else in terms of you want your child to be raised a certain way or some kind of moral standard, that's your choice, and then that you should bear the cost of your own choice. It shouldn't be society should do it. I mean, I think we talked earlier about the founding fathers, how they established this two system where we're not a religious state, but we're here to provide basic needs of civility to citizens, and citizens ultimately decide how they want to govern their lives, and that's the point of the duality of it. Is there's structure and freedom, but it's not freedom without structure.
Yeah, I mean, I went to a private school until about 6th grade, and I'm not going to say that public schools don't have certain things that teachers might teach that you wouldn't disagree with, but I was the way all my other education alongside of our science education, we went to a Christian school and we were taught that the earth is 6,000 years old, and we would watch videos and we were told to
none of this has anything to
do. It matters because the fact that these schools it would be the standard that you can just go to any sort of Christian school and that's your education, not something goes alongside or outside of basic educational standards. Like you can teach them anything if it's a completely privatized system, right? You can
no one is advocating. We've gone well beyond where we started. There's several layers that we've put on top of this. We need to unpack this one step at a time. No one is advocating for crappy education. I hope no one suggests that any of us would disagree on that point. No, what I'm talking about is we have effectively created a monopolistic system. Look, let's at least agree on the basic facts, okay? We can then we can talk about whether things are good or bad.
Yeah.
But we have effectively created a virtual monopoly by deciding that we're going to take public money and only give it to one provider. That's the definition of a monopoly. Okay?
I mean, there's a bunch of different schools. It's not just one school.
We only give the money to one school. If you want to go to that school, you can do it for free. Or you can go to another school and pay all of the cost. That's not a market system. That's not a competitive system. This is the reason why in many places there are no private schools. In most of the areas where there is no second choice, where there is no private school, it's in a poor neighborhood because poor families cannot afford a private school. So in the poor
they
areas,
also get crappy schools because public schools are funded by property taxes. And that's a form of institutional racism where if you're born into a poor neighborhood, you're gonna get a shitty underfunded school because the neighborhood that's funding it has poor property value. So I agree
right.
that the public
And there's
system
no
is
private
inefficient in
school
certain ways. Exactly.
there is no private
Because it's not
school.
profitable.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it was cutting off a little bit, but that was all I had to say.
There's no private school because the families can't afford a private school, right?
That would be a market failure, right?
It's a market failure because all the money is given to
the
one.
private for the private. Sorry, it's cutting out a little bit.
Go ahead.
They should, in theory, be able to start a private school now, and it should be profitable, right? There's not an institution to starting a private school. What you're saying is that the private schools, if they're more efficient and more effective, then they should be able to start on their own and compete, and they should draw students away from that. The problem with taking away from public schools.
That is the way we would want it, but we can't because they're competing against a school that gets to offer free tuition.
Why is that a bad thing?
That's not a competitive system.
Is there any situation in which, maybe somebody wouldn't be able to afford spending money out of their pocket to go towards a private education for their children? Like, there's a reason why we have this barrier. It creates more economic opportunity and equality than any other.
No, Seth. Look,
policy.
I think we're just not. I think we're talking past each other.
Yeah, you guys are.
We don't have a basic set of facts here. This is how. Let me describe how the system works, and then you tell me if you think I've said something wrong. Public money is given to only one provider in each area. You're with me so far, right?
In each school district, they have a school for each school district.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like a public option for education.
Right. The public, in a lot of places, there's school choice programs, but if there's not a school choice program, the money goes to one public school, one provider. Now, in some cases, you have a choice about which public school to go to, but if there's not a public choice, if there's not a school choice program, the money only goes to the public schools. That's the typical model in the United States for the past 200 years, right? If you
Sure.
Okay. If you want to start a private school to compete with the public school, you can. You're right. But there are two big barriers. One is that the state has to approve your agenda. To your point, you were saying, your example, you don't want a Christian school teaching kids things that were wrong. Right. I would argue that it's a family's choice about what that agenda is. I think that teachers and school boards ought to be, more under the control of local families, which is the basic model in the United States up until really 40 years ago, when the school boards and teachers began exerting a great deal more control. But that's a minor issue in the grand scheme of things. The major issue is that it's very difficult to compete against zero tuition, right? Especially in a poor neighborhood. In a poor neighborhood, families find it very difficult to afford private school tuition. And so the public school can be a lot worse, not just a lot worse, but a lot worse than a private school option. And a lot of families would still have to choose it because they wouldn't be able to afford private education. Now, so far, we haven't said anything about whether that's good or bad. I'm just describing the situation, right? this is what we call a virtual monopoly. And it's an actual monopoly where there are no private schools. You've only got public schools because in a lot of poor neighborhoods, there are no private schools that can function because the families can't afford them. Now, what I'm suggesting is that that is not the way any other industry in America is set up. It is not the way that you would want any business in America to be set up. I mean, if you were deciding, from the get-go, from your druthers, how you would set up any business, you wouldn't say, well, I'm going to pick out one provider and I'm going to give it all of the money. And if anybody wants to compete with it, they're going to have to, overcome that difference. You would not expect that to go well. Now, if you layer on top of that the idea that the one provider you pick out is controlled in the public sector, well, that might create further problems. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I think that empirically speaking, we've seen in a lot of places it does create plenty of problems because of the way that school boards are controlled. Sometimes the state government shoves down the throats of local school boards how they want things to work. We saw problems with that in Florida and in other states. And it's not easy all the time to control a school board. To your point, it's not always easy to control a private school either. There are plenty of management problems in private schools. But my point is that if you were designing an industry from scratch, you would not expect things to go well if you were to pick out just one provider and say, these are the people to whom we're going to give all the money and everybody else is going to have to scratch and claw. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, in your situation, you're where there would be no option other than a shitty public school. That would be a bad situation to be put in. And I personally think we should switch to a much more efficient, fair form of funding these public school systems in which, it's more equitable. And the schools that are suffering, obviously, are the ones more deserving of public spending versus a really rich neighborhood that's just like pumping money into their football stadium or something like that, just like completely.
Sure, but empirical data suggests that the biggest problems are not differences in money.
I mean, that's not true at all. I mean, there's obviously bad, poorly run schools that have plenty of money, like in New York State, and there's tons of different reasons why that's not efficient. But the most
but in poor areas of Florida, there are plenty of bad public schools that get far north of $10,000 in the order of $15,000 per head. Private schools are competing with that favorably, both in terms of outcomes and in terms of expenses. The data show that the public school system does not operate effectively either in terms of outcomes or in terms of efficiency.
Yeah, but also what you were saying is the United States is underperforming plenty of other nations, but there's not a single nation that relies heavily on privatized education that way. Every single one of them is a more efficient form of public education. So I don't know where you're drawing an example of a system that would work better than a more functioning public education system.
I think what I'm saying is it's hard to imagine a system that works worse than the one that we have.
There would be. It'd be a fully privatized system, and that's what preceded public education.
Why would you expect it to be worse?
Because it absolutely was worse, and less students got health or got education. There's less.
Well, the empirical data today suggests that, for example, charter schools outperform, whether they're unionized or not. They typically outperform the non-charter public schools.
Well, I think that's a little misleading. Most charter schools are funded by parents, and most parents are more vested in education than what you face at the.
It's not a fair fight, to your point.
Yeah, that's not a fair fight.
I agree. But I don't think that it would be easy to come up with a system that's worse than the one that we have now.
No, I think
we're not last on earth in education. There's absolutely worse.
No, we're not. But the way that we've structured it is bound for failure. There is no other industry in America where you would advocate for public funding of one competitor at the expense of the others. Am I right about that, or is there another example?
There's several examples.
There's plenty.
In different industries. The banking industry, for example, in 2008.
You would advocate for a public sector solution instead of the private sector?
I would advocate that in 2008. That was the reason why our recession / depression didn't get as deep as it once was, because publicizing certain companies over others, because they had fundamentally the most amount of impact on American citizens. We did that with not only with the banking industry, we also did that with the auto industry. Government is supposed to be there to protect the fall of
the reason we had a crash in 2008 is because there was a housing bubble that burst. The reason that we had a housing bubble that burst is because the federal government pressured financial institutions, banks, not just through the Community Reinvestment Act, but through regulatory pressure to extend credit to new groups of people that they did not have experience with.
That was a banking deregulation under Bill Clinton. They weren't pressuring you to do predatory lending. That's a different thing. It's an issue of capitalism.
What regulatory restructuring are you talking about? You're talking about?
I don't have it pulled up, but Bill Clinton in the 90s absolutely deregulated the banking industry, and I don't have it off the top of my head.
No. Look, we got rid of the separation between investment banking and deposit banking, but that had nothing to do with the housing bubble. The housing bubble was driven by commercial banks extending greater credit into places where they did not have experience, particularly experience once a recession hit. And when the bubble burst, I'm not making an argument, I'm just explaining what happened.
Yeah.
When the bubble burst, these markets went south in a hurry and took down a lot of financial institutions. But you cannot argue that it was in the absence of pressure from the federal government to open up these markets. That was what the Community Reinvestment Act was all about. On top of that, what led the burst was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac going down because they were undercapitalized. The reason that they were so undercapitalized is because the federal government was standing behind them and allowed them to expand into trillion-dollar organizations, which they were all too happy to become. They made billions of dollars for their taxpayers. For their shareholders.
Yeah.
Right. And these organizations were encouraging commercial banks to get into these markets, to take these risks. The commercial banks were happy to do it because, they didn't have all that much capital involved either. They had federal guarantees for the deposits that they raised. So they kept expanding as well and lending into these markets. When it burst, Fannie and Freddie went down. A bunch of commercial banks went down. They brought a bunch of investment banks with them, locked up financial markets, and tipped us into a horrific recession, all of which could have been avoided if we didn't have these federally chartered organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, if we didn't have guarantees on these commercial banks' deposits, if we hadn't bailed out commercial banks a generation earlier, teaching these bankers that they could take risks and not suffer consequences themselves personally, and make a lot of money on the way up. There's a lot of public policy that was really bad leading up to that situation. But that all suggests that we need less. I mean, the experience of 2008 suggests that you need less federal intervention in these markets, less guarantees of commercial banks, less guarantees of organizations like Fannie Mae and like Freddie Mac. If you had, less guarantees and less insurance and less bank bailouts, these organizations wouldn't have misbehaved so badly in the first place.
I think I would disagree with that, because the reality is human society doesn't change mostly. If you seem you're a very big historian. As you see, what happens with privatization is study economics, it shows that most people when they have no limits or rail guards, they tend to want to acquire more. So if you go straight to privatization of industries, these industries are going to want more. You're saying about the banking industry, you said, well, it was just because the government was subsidizing a lot of them, and so they felt comfortable taking all these high risk. Essentially, I'm oversimplifying what you're saying, but the reality is the banks got greedy because they saw there was money there. They saw there was more opportunity for money, so they wrote loans that they knew the people didn't qualify for. And that isn't the fault of government. That's the fault of just human nature. That human nature is for us to take more when there's more available.
Yeah, I
And
don't think that's true, Jesse. I don't think the historical record backs you up on that.
in terms
I
of
think
what,
that banks are more conservative when they are not backed up by the federal government.
no, because I mean,
Yeah, I mean, but what would you suggest? Like in the 2008, like millions of more people would have lost all their money if we had not bailed out these banks in the first place. And I'm very against corporate bailouts and subsidies. I'm a left libertarian, so I'm pretty suspicious of large corporations and their predatory practices. But this is more like an issue of government being controlled by these corporations in the first place. And especially I'm curious what your thoughts on campaign finance are, because I hear a lot of libertarians with different perspectives on that.
Let's wrap the banking industry though. The reason that banks take so many risks is because they don't have a great deal of capital, and the reason that they don't have a great deal of capital is because their shareholders and their creditors don't require that of them, because there are federal government guarantees for all of their deposits. They're able to raise money in ways that their creditors believe is without a great deal of risk. Commercial banks would be much, much more conservative, which is what I think you would want if the government weren't standing behind them. And remember that the two biggest disasters that led to the 2008 failure were Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This was not a situation that was led by commercial banks. This was a situation that was led by the collapse of Fannie and Freddie. And not only did they fail to have either a 6% or 8% capital threshold like huge banks and medium-sized banks respectively were required. These are organizations that had something like 2% capital. And the reason that they had such small capital was because the federal government was standing behind them. And they expanded to become trillion-dollar organizations. You're absolutely right, in my view, that these are private sector organizations that got carried away. But the reason that they got carried away is because they could. And the reason they could was because they had federal backing.
Well, I would counter that because as you see now, banks are always they're in the business of future earnings. That's what they do. So they're always going to overreach to show profitability to their stockholders. That's just the way. That's the nature of the business. So to sit there and say that, well, the banks are, if the government gave them this extra comfort to be aggressive and to show their stockholders value, it's I don't think that's going to stop. I think they're going to continue to anticipate what I mean. Prime example, and I know we had to move.
So you're saying there's no way to get the government out of it?
No. What I'm saying is government and private industry has historically worked better when they work together versus one trying to eliminate the other. That's my main point. Taking out one and not dealing with the other issue is just disaster because private industry can't regulate itself. I mean, this is going back to even Teddy Roosevelt and his idealism. But the reality is private industry left by itself will never be able to control its innate driving force in it, which is profitability. It's impossible.
That's right. But long-term profitability is not what we see in the banking industry because of the government intervention. With other industries that are less regulated, that is what you see, is you see greater long-term drive toward profitability. But in the banking industry, you see these boom bust cycles because they take ridiculous risks because they have this asymmetric portfolio of what happens when they do well versus what happens when they do poorly. Yeah. When they do poorly, the federal government takes it in the shorts. And so it's in their interest to take these enormous risks. I think that we all agree that that's not the way we want the system to work.
So if we're going to talk about campaign financing, I want to make sure you have the last word on the banking, because I know Seth wanted to talk about the campaign financing.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest concern with corporations is their, like Jesse was saying, their innate interest towards profitability.
Sure.
And they're like the goal under capitalism of a corporation is to consolidate competition.
And what is what's the problem with the profit motive in your view?
I think there's I'm a big proponent of markets and profit. I think it depends on.
You were saying the biggest problem with corporations is their innate drive for profit. I'm saying what is problematic about that?
Well, let me finish. Yeah, their innate drive towards profit leads them to it's an endless form of profit where they need to consolidate competition so that they can control prices, and that makes an inherent conflict of interest if you're wanting to preserve a free market when every single firm in the market is trying to create a non-free market.
Agreed. So you would believe in the Sherman Antitrust Act playing a more robust role in promoting competition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, profit leads corporations to take advantage of small businesses primarily, which I'm sure you would say small businesses are the solution towards more competition, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by small businesses. There are not too many markets, not zero, but there aren't too many markets in the United States that don't have some competition. The empirical data show that as long as you have 3 competitors, you don't have a lot of price control, but that's sort of on a case by case basis. It sort of depends on the nature of the market.
Yeah, there are tons of enterprises and industries in which smaller and smaller amounts of businesses are consolidating competition, and we had like giant conglomerates in the early 1910s that owned every single business, and it all stemmed up from one giant conglomerate. And that's something that, like I was mentioning, is like we were a classical liberal society, and we have tested and seen the results of certain policies, tons of the policies that you were advocating for. And we've seen many of them fail because of giant monopolization of industry. And we're a less monopolized industry in certain ways than we were at that time, absolutely. But certain wealth inequality continues to grow and continues to consolidate. And this gives a certain
but we're mashing up some unrelated concepts there.
No, I'm leading to something.
Okay.
It's private authoritarianism, private control over society is just as dangerous as state control over society.
Why is that?
Because the private industries end up controlling the state.
How?
Also, they control legislation. Would you contend that legislation is mostly controlled by corporations at this point?
No, it's not mostly controlled by corporations. Corporations have huge influence over legislation, and that's a real problem, particularly when it affects industrial policy. But mostly, no, of course not. Most legislation through state legislatures is just, wacky, unproductive crap that, is driven by weird social pressures. A lot of weird corporate pressures too. But aside from corporations controlling the legislature, which I think is a governance problem as much as it is a business problem, I don't think it's fair to compare the authoritarianism that a government can wield over your life with control in a particular industry by a company. Yes.
Well, there are different forms of authoritarianism. Okay, the government absolutely has a monopoly over power and violence, and that's something that the corporations can't necessarily take over. Although some libertarians would argue for private corporations to have private armies and private military or police stations, stuff like that. So they're advocating for the same forms of power and violence, but just
let's not
adding
get off the
profit
beaten
motive.
path.
I don't think
I don't think it's fair to use the same word to describe a government's monopoly over the use of force, to use that same term to describe a corporation's control of pricing in some particular industry. I think that's an.
No, I'm just saying you could theoretically do a similar form of authoritarianism if you really had all privatized systems, which is not necessarily what you're advocating for. You still.
No, I don't know anyone that's advocating for that.
Oh, I've definitely talked to anarcho-capitalists.
Okay, well, okay, that's great.
I mean, we're getting off a little off topic.
You found some fruit loops.
I know. I'm not even. I'm a little off topic here.
But yeah, okay. I don't think that if the word authoritarianism describes a government's monopoly over the use of force and the ability to impose certain social structures, then that same word cannot be applied to a corporation with a certain amount of control over pricing in some particular industry. Those are two very, very different things. I'm not
just talking about pricing. I'm just saying you have the government, which has its ways of being authoritarian. Okay, but you also go to a job every single day and you spend 8 hours, 10 hours. It depends on which country you live in. And that is your private life as well. And corporations can absolutely control what you do with your private life. They can say, hey, I know it's your day off, but I really need you to come in. Well, I'm saying there are forms of authority that private institutions have over you, whether or not it's the government with a monopoly of violence. They still have a coercive authority figure over you. There's definitely forms of authoritarianism.
Look, it is true that there are crappy work environments out there, but I think you belie your lack of fairness when you use terms like coercive and authoritarian. I mean, you're obviously motivated to make some case here. To be fair, though, I don't like to use the same language that we use for force and apply it to, a work situation. No one is I hope no one that we know is advocating for a corporation to have the right to use force. You can, even if you're a contracted employee, you can always quit. You can change employers. I'm not suggesting it's easy.
That doesn't make it better necessarily. It doesn't mean you're not in the if you quit your job, that doesn't necessarily mean your next job will be better or outside of the same institutional hierarchies that exist.
No, of course. That
doesn't make you any more free necessarily if you just quit.
Okay, but Seth, can we not use words like freedom when talking about, an employment contract? In the United States, you are free to quit your job. You are free to change your job. You are free. I think you'll agree with me that we all believe in your First Amendment right to form a union or any other bargaining group to try to leverage up power against your employer. Entrepreneurs will also tell you sometimes it's a rough day when your favorite employee quits too. But we don't use words like lack of freedom and coercion and authoritarianism.
I mean, they absolutely apply. They might apply.
No, they don't apply in the same sense as they do to the use of force. Those are apples and oranges.
Here is you're talking about a negative freedom when I'm talking about a positive freedom.
What's a positive freedom?
Positive freedoms are freedom to pursue something, freedom to pursue something without, institutional barriers. And you're talking about a freedom from government specifically. Now, I think you should be free to pursue.
No, I think that you should be free from other people.
Sure.
Whether you call that a government or not, I think that you should be free to make decisions for yourself. And
I agree.
That includes for whom you work and who you hire. It includes how you associate, how you conduct your employment negotiations. I think we're in agreement with all of that. I just don't like it when we adopt this weird language where we seem to.
Freedom and authoritarianism is weird language.
I think it's very weird language to appropriate that language and use it in labor law.
It's a difference of opinion.
I think we have perspectives, and
yeah, I'm just talking about advancing more freedom. Okay, you can have a more free society
if we do what?
If we create a more equitable access to certain resources that everybody needs. Everybody needs healthcare and education. That's not something we should create barriers for based on commodity, based on.
And you believe that what's we when we create barriers? I think you're advocating use the government to tell corporations what to do, I guess.
Forms of commodification.
What's
commodification, privatization of things, creating a barrier towards education based on how much money you are worth. That is an institutional barrier towards education, towards a freedom, some way you can advance your own educational skills, ways you might be very capable of doing something, but nobody's going to hire you if you don't have their certificate of education through a certain, higher education. And I think that many other countries around the world have showed you can create a lot more educated, skilled workforce if you advance public education to the tertiary level, something like that, where you can some sort of positive freedom, creating more freedom for somebody so that they can have a more equitable society with more competition, with a higher skilled, a lot more workers in certain industries that you can incentivize by, taking away institutional barriers. You can make things like education and healthcare, not just for people seeking education and healthcare, but people trying to work in the healthcare industry. Like you can create more nurses and doctors if you're not like, hey, you want to become a nurse or doctor? Well, you have to take on $200,000 of debt for the rest of your life. You sure you're going to be competent and this is definitely the career path for you? There's a lot of fear that keeps people from pursuing their freedoms, their desired and passions, things that they might be better at if instead they just choose something that's more safe. It's
right. So you're using the word freedom to indicate an ability to get a free education.
Oh, I'm just talking about your freedom to pursue your own life. And education.
Right, but the example you picked was to get a free education.
Oh, that's just an example. Education can be a barrier to you advancing, your own.
Well, of course it is. I mean, there's 1,000 barriers to success, and education is one of those things that has proven that an investment has to be made for there to be a certain level of success.
Yeah.
We know that. I don't like the appropriation again of this term barrier to say that something
between you, right?
But there isn't anything. What you're suggesting that is the need to make an investment is somehow a barrier. I mean, you carefully choose these strange words that I think connote something that is not really quite accurate. What we mean is that education is expensive, and it is. What can we do to make it less expensive? We can, make sure that we don't accidentally throw up barriers to those who provide the service and those who want to obtain the service.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to find some magic wand to make it less expensive. I think what you're suggesting is that we find a way to make someone else pay for it. I'm not suggesting that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's the core of your suggestion.
Not necessarily somebody else, but you would pay for it at different points in your life through taxation. You're still going to end up paying for your own education by being taxed.
Right. Well, that's what student loans do, right?
Yeah. And then that's the same idea. I just think it's less efficient, obviously. If you take an 18-year-old and say, hey, start off your life, start your career with loads and loads of debt and try to advance that's creating a barrier that didn't exist prior. Well, you're still going to end up paying for your education over time. But if that
right, but how would you suggest paying for higher education for someone who, didn't have the $100,000 or $10,000 or $300,000 to drop down? how would you suggest that be financed?
I mean, higher education is not even remotely expensive compared to anything on our budget. Do you know how much it costs? Between 40 and 80 billion dollars at max. That's like 5% of our military budget. That is
No, I was just asking how you would.
Yeah.
I mean, are you suggesting that we shift it to someone else paying for it, or are you suggesting that someone undertake that with debt? I think those are the only two choices, aren't they?
Spending. You could cut government spending, and that would still fund the system. Like,
right. So you're suggesting the government pay for it?
Yeah. Well, I'm saying you pay for it through the social service orchestrated by the government in some. I'm not saying we need.
No, Seth, yeah. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just asking, what would you do about higher education? You would have the government pay for it.
I'm saying you would pay through taxes. People would pay for it, right? You'd still pay for it.
The government would pay for it.
Well, you're still paying for it.
I'm trying to agree with you. You're saying that the government would pay for higher education under your plan.
The government would fund public education, right? Free at the point of service. Yes, that's what they do in countless other social democracies around the world, and they have a lot ease of access to education, and they have a lot more, at this point it's enough to, like, if you're in a job, they say, do you have a college or a college degree, and that's enough of a disqualifier for you to not get a job, is just having a college degree. That's a barrier in its own to being to getting a good job, just being educated on its own. And that would create a more, like, competitive environment where you have to actually compete based on your merits, not just having gone to school and passed certain classes.
Agreed. It's not clear to me that it's in our society's interest to send more people to college these days rather than fewer. We're up to nearly 50%. And I think that the data are quickly showing that the value of a college education is declining rather than increasing. So it's not clear to me that we get a better outcome by socializing how we finance higher education. I think I would leave the system the way it is.
And we're going to stop the topic right here because we're at 11 p.m. And it was a great conversation, but I wanted to take
so much farther.
Yeah, I didn't want to. I know we promised 11, and I didn't want.
That's all right. Go ahead. There was one more thing you wanted to ask, I think.
One more thing I wanted to ask. I know you're right now in a primary at a tough. How's financing going? I know campaign financing. I know when I was a candidate, campaign financing was all about just calling. It was so annoying, but I had to do it. So I want to know how that's going. How's the fundraising going? How's the primary going? How's everything going?
I appreciate you asking. Traditionally, in the Libertarian Party, we, as you might imagine, we are not a party that's awash in cash, right? Yeah. And so traditionally, there's not a great deal of fundraising that takes place before the nomination. The nomination will take place in May of 2024. It is an open convention of fewer than 1,000 candidates. There are a couple of other candidates besides myself. It is likely, I don't want to accidentally say it's a done deal, right? It is likely that I'll be the nominee. And so the traditional way this is undertaken is for the candidate to provide the vast majority of the cash himself. But having said that, it's not a ridiculously, insanely expensive process. Because it's an open convention, you're reaching out to a limited pool, right? You're making your case to the Libertarian Party, which is not gigantic. It is big, it is expensive, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're not talking about millions. Now, you do want to be ready for the moment that the nomination takes place to expand that to millions quite quickly, right? And so in our case, we have a very professional staff already in place and growing. We have 14 people on our team that are lightly paid, part-time people mostly, just a couple of full-time people. And we have another dozen on an advisory panel that they're not paid. And then we have a bunch of volunteers that help with outreach. So altogether, it's quite a big team. And growing. And so we believe that through a combination of that team and our ability to contract for certain resources, particularly for fundraising, we'll be ready the moment that the nomination takes place. And you have to be, because there's a relatively brief period of time, right? Less than 6 months, a little bit more than 5 months between the May convention and the November election. So you need to be ready to go right away. And it's very important to us, we believe, as a matter of strategy, to come right out of the box and spend a bunch of money moment one, because we believe that the secret to success is getting the attention of paid media right away, as well as from earned media. But the paid media is a component of that you've got to spend some money to differentiate yourself from the Republican Party and from the Democratic Party, but also to make a splash and let people know that there's a third option and that it's very, very different from the other parties. So in that sense, things are going well. It's a long process. I've already been at this for a whole bunch of months, and we have almost a year to go. So there is quite a bit of time and energy and money that goes into this, not just on my part, but like I say, that whole team. So it's an important time, but it gives us the time to make the case that our campaign is quite a bit different, not just from Republicans and Democrats, but is quite a bit different from the other campaigns that have been run in the past inside the Libertarian Party, as well as from the other campaigns that are run inside the Libertarian Party today, in the sense that we are larger, more professional. We have a much more bold, principles forward, much more transformational platform that we're running on. We call it the Gold New Deal, by the way. People can read about it at goldnewdeal.org. And the other difference from the other campaigns is that I personally have a background in public policy and public service, 2 different careers. My second career, of course, was as a police officer. I was on the road for 11 and a half years in Broward County, but that was from the age of 49 to 60. I was a professional economist for a couple of decades. I worked for the White House for a couple of years, worked for other federal agencies. I taught economics at 3 different universities. Had my own business, educating financial services professionals and providing strategic consulting. And of course, I was an advocate in Washington for more competitive markets in the financial services business for quite a few years. So I was an economist for quite some time. And that combination of having a couple of careers in public service, I think, will not only differentiate us from other campaigns in the Libertarian Party, but will cause, during the general election, will cause donors to give us a look. I think it'll cause media to give us a look, and ultimately for voters to give us a look that the Libertarian candidates in the past haven't always been able to earn. So we're pretty optimistic.
That sounds really good. I want to thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time. And
thank you.
The groundwork coming on forums like these, we're progressives. So coming in forums like these, in the fire, taking the rapid fires, and sticking by your position is something that is different in politics. A lot of people stay in their bubble and they venture out, but it's noble that you're doing this, and I'm actually really impressed that you were able to.
Well, you're awfully kind to say so. I got to say that I think you guys are terrific. And I really mean, I don't mean to sound gratuitous. No. I really get the impression that, you care, you want our economy to work better and the lives of Americans to be better. I agree with you wholeheartedly. There's obviously some differences in how you all and how we all approach certain things, but I just, couldn't be more pleased that there are people like you who represent the positions that you do. And I'm grateful for everything you do. And I'm grateful for you to give me the chance to explain how we see things as well.
Thank you so much, Mike.
I appreciate you, Mike. Definitely wish you the best of success in the Libertarian primary. I mean, I don't have any dog in that fight anymore. I left the Libertarian Party a handful of years ago. So Best of
Nice
luck
to
with
bring you
that.
back, man.
Thank you. Yeah, let's talk again maybe early next year.
Yeah.
Yeah, right before the nomination is decided for sure. Yeah, I mean, hopefully you take down the two-party system because it's a corrupt system that doesn't help anybody really. Nobody needs just two options. We need more options out there.
Yep.
I agree
It's
with
pretty
you
clear it's
wholeheartedly. Thank
for
you.
democracy. So, thank you for coming on the show. We will, if you want to plug your
Twitter,
Instagram or your
everything.
Twitter, whatever you got.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mike,
And I will. We'll be promoting it a great deal, I'm sure.
Do you want to plug? Do you want to
Twitter,
say
Instagram, anything?
Oh, you mean ours?
Yeah.
Yes, I would. The one place that I think that people should go if they're interested in learning more about the campaign is the basic website. That's Mike ter Maat. I have a visitor. MiketerMaat.com. Of course, you'd have to spell it right. It's MiketerMaat, AA. Or people can just go to goldnewdeal.org, which is easier to spell, and they link back and forth so people can see that. I have to say, my dogs stay downstairs during podcasts, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know how, but the last few months, they have figured out when it's the end. I think it must be when I say the words thank you, or so, I don't know what the trick is, but there's some word or something I'm doing. Maybe it's the inflection of my voice. I don't know. And lately they've been running upstairs. That's the first time they actually came on camera. I apologize for that.
We're glad.
That's awesome.
He finally figured it out.
They finally figured it out. I'm going to have to start keeping them off the block off the stairwell or something. That was funny.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for being patient with me.
It's been a good conversation, Mike. Hope to see you again. Best of luck.
Thank you. We'll stay in touch.
Thank you.
All right.
All right. You guys take care.
I'm not imagine more. All right.